In the last video, we took a look at images and we saw basic things we could do with images in HTML. Now, in this video, we're going to take a look at something even more important, and we're going to be looking at HTML forms. We're going to be looking at forms in HTML. So, like I always do, I'm just going to save this as forms. I'm going to do a save as, and I'm going to do forms.html, and then I'm going to just do all files. If you want to see everything in the folder, by now you should be familiar with this. And I'm just going to save this as forms, and I'm going to change images here to forms, so I'll be on the forms web page. And then just for the purpose of being able to track where I am, I'm going to change the title to forms, and I'm going to clear out everything in the body so I can have a clean slate to work with. So I do a file, I save, and then I refresh, and I have forms. So let me just put in a headline H1 and just do forms, and I close out my H1, and I do a file, I save, I refresh, and I have forms. So what are forms? Now, forms are very important in HTML and in programming, and let me say web development generally. Now, if you were going to develop a web application, that's an application that runs in browsers, or you wanted to build a mobile app, so to speak, you would find out that at some point you need to collect inputs. You need to have the user of your interface give you information. For instance, you want to have a login form where people put in their username and their passwords. You want to have a registration form where people sign up for something, and then you want to get their names, their emails, their phone numbers, their contact address, and all of that. So you find out that each time you need people to give information, or you need a user to give information to your application, they have to do that via forms. So there has to be something with which they can interact with you, and something with which they can submit input to you. And this is where forms come in. So as someone who is learning HTML, it is very important that you pay attention and you understand forms, because forms represent a building block to how you can have users interact with your application. So how do you write forms? Well, it's very simple. In order for you to get started with a form, all you need to do is to use a form tag, and it's so simple. All you want to do is you want to do your form tag, and by now you should be very familiar and comfortable with all of this. So you want to do your form tag, and you want to end your form tag, and once you do that, you immediately have a form. Then when you have your form, the next thing you want to do is you want to have the inputs. So the input represents what you want the user to do on your form. So the input can, for instance, be a text field where people enter text. It can be a radio button where people click something. It can be a checkbox. It can be a submit. It can be just a button where people, have to click to get things done. Let's take a look at this so that you would see how it works. So I'm going to start with a simple input, a text input. So what you want to do is, now that you have written your form, you want to do an input. So you want someone to input something into your form, and you want to do a type, and the type of input you want is a text. So that type becomes the attribute of the input, and once you do that, you want to just close that. And if you do a file and you save and you do a refresh, you now have a text input. So right there on your form, you can now have a form where someone can, for instance, enter their name and say, this is my name, and there you go, you have a text input. Aside from a text input, you can have a radio. If you do input and you do the type of the input, you can have a radio. And then if you close out that and you do a file and you save and you do a refresh, you now see that you have this radio button which you can use to, you know, toggle between true and false and all of that, and that's a radio button. Then you can have a submit and say input and say the type of the input is submit. So once you have filled out a form, you can go ahead to submit that form. If I do a save and I do a refresh, you see I have a text, that's a text input. I have a radio, I have a radio input, and then I have a submit, which when you click normally, you should submit that form. So you have all these different kinds of inputs which you can use to build out your form. Now that we have covered some basic form inputs, let's try to build out a form using what we have learned. So I'm going to clear out all this and I'm going to start from scratch. So I'm going to do file, I'm going to do a save, I'm going to do a refresh, and there I have a blank slate once again. So let's go. I'm going to do form, of course, that declares that I'm doing a form, and I'm going to close out my form that ends my form. And then right in here, I'm going to do a label. I'm going to just do a label, and I'm going to do for. I'm going to do, let me make this a label for my username. And I'm going to just go ahead and close that, and I'm going to write username, and I'm going to close out that label. So let me just close out the label, and let me break this just to have some kind of, okay, let me just write it out first so that you see. Then I'm going to do an input field, just like we talked about input, and then the type of my input is going to be a text. Then I'm going to do an ID for this form, which is going to be username. And then I'm going to do a name, which is going to be, I can just do name, and I'm going to close this out. Now let's do a file and save and see how this works. So I'm going to save, and if I do a refresh, you can now see I have username equals this, and then I have this box. Let's add one more before I explain what this does and how it works. So I'm going to have another label, and I'm going to do a for. I'm going to say this is for pass. I'm going to close out that label, and I'm going to write pass what, and I'm going to do label close label, and then I'm going to have input type equals password ID equals the pass, and name equals password. Okay, so I have that. Now let me do a file and save and refresh, and let's see what this gives. So I'll do file, I do a save and I refresh, and you see I now have username and I have password. Now let's test this out. If I do username as username And then if I do password as password, you can now see that the password field is hidden. So what is happening behind the scene here? Let's take a look at it. Now, in HTML forms, when you use labels, you can use a label to attach a description to a form input. So we talked about input just now, that the input tells the form the kind of input that you want to have. So what kind of input are you expecting from your user? If you're expecting a text input, just normal text input like a username, then you have to put the type as text. If you are expecting that there should be a checkbox, then you want to add that type. And if you are expecting that it should be a text area, you want to add that type. So the kind of input we are looking for here is just a normal text box where someone can write, for instance, something like a username. And we have in here a text input. Now, when you have a text input like that, you can give your input an ID just to be able to locate that input. So an ID is like a unique identifier that you have given to your input. Like, okay, this is my username input. So you have this input, this text attribute ID, where you have username. Let me just get that right, username. And then you have ID of username. Now, when you create a label for this particular input with ID of username, what you are saying is, before the input comes up, I want you to attach a description to this input so that when my user comes, they can see a description for the input. So for instance, for this username, the user would see, okay, I'm expected to enter a username at this point. So that label does that. And then when you write the label, you have label ending and then entered label. It wraps around the description you want to put in. For instance, you can just say, instead of username here, I can decide to change it to email address. And if I do a file and I do a save, I do a refresh, you see I now have email address right there. So what you are doing here is that you are creating a label, and then you are saying this label is for this text input. So this particular text input, this label is for it. So anytime HTML reads this code, HTML attaches this username to this text input because it has the same ID. So you are saying this label is for the ID of username, and then it would attach itself to this text input with ID of username. And then the same thing goes for password. You have a label for pass, and then the ID is for pass. And then you have the third attribute, because right now in this input we have three attributes. We have the type, we have the ID, and then we have the name. Now the name attribute is used when you now begin to build applications, because once this form is submitted, the content of this form will now be attached to this name called username. And then when you advance in your web development skills or your coding skills, you can just grab these and get the information contained in it. So right now, what I'm going to do is just to add a little bit of formatting to this by doing a break here, so that it looks like a real form. I'm just going to do a break. I'm going to do another break here. I'm going to do a break here. And I'm going to do a file, I'm going to save, and if I do a refresh, there you have it. So you have the email and you have the password. So I can change this to, let me change it back to username. And then I do a file, I save, and if I do a refresh, you have username and password. And then if you look at the password field, the input for the password, you can see input, the type is not text, because in text you would see what is written in that input field. The type here is password. And when you now try to enter a password in there, you can see there is a kind of obfuscation that goes on. You can't really see what is being typed. It comes in like dots, and that is the password. So HTML has to do with you entering your inputs, and when you enter your inputs, you can just go ahead from the input. You can now choose the type of input you want, and when you choose the type of input you want, you build out your forms based on those inputs. I'll see you in the next video where we take a closer look at forms and we do a little bit of examples so that you have a solid idea of how forms work, and then we take it off from there. Bye bye.